Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And in today's episode, we're returning for a continuing discussion of drafting in games. So this is a follow-up of our last What We Talk About episode, where we talked really generally about what is drafting as a mechanism. What do certain games that have drafting utilized look like? What are drafting games? What are games that utilize drafting? And today is going to be a continuation of that conversation. We're going to focus more a little bit on the decisions and skills typically tested in drafting games, which I think will really delve into what are the feel of playing drafting games and why do these games have appeal? Why do we come back to them? Why have I played Seven Wonders more than 700 times? I don't know if I can get to the bottom of that exactly on this episode, but we'll at least, we'll get at some of the ideas. And then in the second half of the episode, Jake and I are going to talk about considerations in designing drafting games, which I think will be a little bit different than we typically tackle some of the conversations on this show, more design focused. We'll be talking about the knobs that designers can need to be thinking about when they're designing drafting games and how turning those different knobs that exist within a drafting game can really affect the flow of the game and the feel of the game and the decision space ultimately created.
Sounds great. I can't wait to dive into this conversation. Before we get to that, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. But before that even, Brendan, I wanted to just share a quick story with you, just so you and our listeners can know about how I'm showing up today in my body. Just prior to this recording session 15 minutes ago, I was out walking my dog. It's a beautiful day in St. Louis, 70 and sunny, and a bee flew down my shirt, stung me in the back right between my shoulder blades, and nobody else is here at my house right now. My wife's out working. So I was in the bathroom with like a credit card doing like a full on contortionist routine, trying to like
get the stinger
out the stinger with the credit card.
Jake, I'm so sorry.
I think I got it. I took some antihistamines. So
nice.
If I start breaking out in hives or something, that's
if I see you puff up, I'll ask you to type Bridget's number in chat. And we'll get you help as quickly as possible. Wow, dedication.
That's right. So I'm going to try and fight through that to bring y'all a great podcast this week.
Dang.
Yeah, and the thing we wanted to note with housekeeping is just very quickly on our Patreon page, one of the benefits that we give to our Patreon supporters is that we record all our podcasts in video and upload those to our Patreon page in sort of an unedited format. So that means you get our kind of pre-show preamble where we strategize sometimes what we're going to talk about in the episode, sometimes just share funny personal stories, sometimes have serious questions and discussions like the one we did today, talking about how our Patreon pages, can work best for our supporters. So that's up there for anyone who's interested in supporting us. And I just learned about a new toggle where I turned on free trial. So if anybody's interested in going on there and checking out some videos for free, I think you can, I don't know how long it's for, maybe like a month or 2 weeks or something. I would encourage you to do that. I'll have a link to that Patreon in the description of this podcast, and you can go check out the videos. I did like a short, vlog, like 4 minutes, a tour of Gamers Ranch. So stuff like that. That's just like small bonus content you can check out for free. So I would encourage you to do so.
Let's talk about drafting, Jake. So I felt like we had a lot of momentum from the last episode. There was a lot of fun discussion in our Discord about drafting in games and sort of conversations around if we got it right of sort of this broad definition. And I think for the most part, people kind of felt like, yeah, we get where you're coming from. We also don't think Dominion's a drafting game, so I agree with that. And it sounds like you agree with that now too. So that was my one, like, that's address us saying Dominion's a drafting game in the last episode. Because I think if we're that inclusive, maybe we start to lose any sort of definitional rigor that helps us define what is a drafting game at all. Then
Right. The idea that perhaps our incredibly broad definition that we went with intentionally to try and touch on that survey of all the different types of drafting mechanisms that can exist. If you use that, almost any board game mechanism can fall within it, right? Basically,
Yeah.
anytime you're making a choice between two things could be declared drafting under that definition. And that probably isn't the most helpful thing. I would tend
No.
to agree as well. Yeah.
It's one of those things though where, I think drafting, it doesn't matter. This is one of those things where it, you can feel it, right? You can kind of say this feels like a drafting game to me, and other people say this doesn't feel like a drafting game. And I think ultimately the answer to whether or not something is a drafting game is if most people agree it is. Like that's the best way to kind of tell, because it's all about subjectivity with
Right.
definitions like this. But let's talk about, we talked a lot about sort of different formats last time, and I think this time we're going to start with these decisions and skills tested. So I said at the top of the show, Jake, that I've played a lot of drafting games, and I think you have too. I've played Seven Wonders over 700 times on Board Game Arena. I've played Challengers more than 250 times. I think you've played Challengers a ton there. I've now played Bunny Kingdom almost 100 times. So I really love drafting games. That doesn't even take into account things like right now, there's a new Magic the Gathering format out. I don't play Magic the Gathering constantly, but I tend to check in with the game every couple of years where there's a set that seems to really hook me and appeal. So right now there's this set, I don't know if you're aware of it, Jake, called Murder
It's the
at
murder mystery, right?
It's the murder mystery set on Ravnica. Yeah, Murder
Which
at
is like my
Karlov
favorite
Manor.
genre of thing. It does it feel like murder mystery esque, or I remember
Oh,
a little while ago there was like a Magic the Gathering set that was like a gothic wedding theme. And I was
oh
kind of
yeah.
like, I don't think that's doing much for me. I
This
don't know.
set has the thematic dressing of it. There's really there's tools, that feel like the murder weapons in Clue. There's a theme where there's detectives, and then you can build around these sort of detective creatures. There's investigate and clue tokens. Uh, Ultimately, I think it is dressed nicely, but doesn't feel that much like you're solving any sort of, it's still Magic, but it has
Yeah.
some nice window dressing, and it's a fun set because you can kind of lean towards, I like playing sets where 5-color could be viable, and it feels like it's almost viable here, but there's lots of fixing to play like 3-color decks, and I like playing lots of colors because I think it's fun. So anyway, that's just to say I love drafting. I think they offer really interesting decisions, and I think for me the foundational skill tested in drafting games, that's most, for what sort of sets them apart for me, is drafting games are really good at presenting apples to oranges decisions, that are variable in terms of the evaluations, these sort of comparative evaluations that players have to make. So because drafting games tend to have these large sort of pools of input in the things you could draft, oftentimes being cards, or maybe in things like Cascadia, tokens and tiles mixed, you get really sort of divergent pairings of things that you're comparing. Of, would it be better to take this apple or to take this orange? And it's hard to compare them directly. Whereas sometimes I feel like in other games, you have a little bit more direct comparison of what is good, or maybe you're offered consistently similar choices. And there's different things that are presented as a barrier, maybe the timing around when you could grab those things, competing with other players. Whereas with drafting games, it's so consistently like, do you want this or do you want this? Would it be better to take X or would it be better to take Y? And I think that the variability of those decisions is what keeps drafting games really, really interesting to me, is that even though you're offered the same types of decisions over and over again, oftentimes you can play the same game and never have the exact same decision twice. Whereas I don't think all genres produce that quite as frequently.
Yeah, let's dig into this a little bit more because I think somebody listening at home might be asking themselves
Brendan,
like,
that's
okay,
just games. Yeah.
yeah, is that just games, like this kind of comparative evaluation? Is that just the same as, right, like a worker placement? I could go to this space over here, or I could go to this space over here, and those offer me very different things.
Yeah.
What I think for me, drafting, and let's maybe we'll take kind of like a pack drafting, like
Sure.
closed
Like a closed
pack.
information.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
We're drafting Magic the Gathering. Let's just use that as an example. Probably
Great.
familiar to most people. I think the distinction is that every single turn of the draft, right, you have the exact same choice of like which one card do you take.
Uh huh.
However, there's a tremendous amount of variety an infinite
Yeah.
combination of what cards, or approaching infinite combination of what sequence of 12 cards could be in there,
Yep.
so that even though you're being asked the same question over and over, that question is completely different on every, not just every time you play the game, but on every turn within a single pack draft. You're going to be getting a
Yeah.
question you've never seen before. Whereas if you take a worker placement game, there might be different tokens strewn about. They don't come out in the exact same order. So you can like recreate some of this. But fundamentally, like the options you have available to you in most worker placement games, like your Agricola or your Stone Age or your Lost Ruins of Arnak, are so much more restrained.
Yeah.
You can kind of get your arms around those choices more in that context than in a draft where the
Combinatorics are
variety
just
is
so high.
impossible. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's right, Jake. I think ultimately, yes, like games are about comparative decision making on some level, like almost all games, right? Even if I'm playing just one, I'm making a comparative decision around, do I want to write this word or do I want to write this word? But I think the magnitude is what really feels different here. I'm really glad you highlighted that. And it's a spectrum, right? Like Keyflower is a game where it's a worker placement game that's also kind of this auction game for tiles. And I've played Keyflower enough times now that even though there's real variability in the tiles that come out, all of a sudden I've played it enough, I have a sense for, okay, this is the pool before me and this is the relationship between the pieces that will exist, that I feel is just way harder as a human being to wrap my head around, even when I'm playing something like Seven Wonders or even to some extent Sushi Go. Though I feel like Sushi Go is like trying to live in this line of like, okay, you open the first pack and you get a sense for which direction do you push a little bit more clearly. But that's the fun of drafting games, is you look at the first pack and you sort of say, which strategic direction do I run in? And I think even to compare another genre, to not talk about worker placement games, Welcome to is about comparative decision making too, right? That's a roll and write game where there's different cards that you're flipping, where you can choose to engage with these different elements in the game. Maybe you're going for pools, or you're writing numbers. But you're always writing numbers, but maybe you're going for pools or parks or increasing the value of things. And I think that it's constrained enough and the puzzle is similar enough each time that it doesn't quite feel like there's this cornucopia of so many different types of fruits that could pop into the decisional basket to pick from, as they do in drafting games. I think that's what keeps these games fresh, right? If you were just
Yeah.
dealt the same pack every single time, these games lose their magic pretty immediately.
I think too, it depends on the drafting game big time, because there's a
Mm-hmm.
huge difference between Magic Gathering
Yeah,
and Sushi Go
sure.
in what is possible in a
In the card
pack,
pool. Yep.
right? Where, because I think the difference in a drafting game like Magic from Welcome to would be, the draft in Magic is kind of like the speculation that exists in Welcome to if you were using dice that were like 100 sided, or the cards went up to like number 100 instead of just number 14 or something.
Yep.
um right, because like you just have a way better sense of like, this is what's possible to come up, where in if you're playing Magic, you're kind of going in one direction, and then all of a sudden you see a mythic rare, one of in the set of 360 possible cards or whatever, and this one thing that was totally unlikely to exist in this entire set of cards that you're playing with, much less in the pack you just opened, shows up, and that can like fundamentally change your game in a way
Yeah.
that's really fun, interesting, and exciting.
Yep, totally. So I just looked it up, Jake, because I was curious. This doesn't look at unique cards for Sushi Go. In Sushi Go, there's 108 cards, and a bunch of those are not unique, right? Because there's a bunch of copies of sashimi or nigiri. So the
Yeah.
unique
What do you
card
play
count
with, like 6 different card types or
types,
something?
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's probably 10 unique card types if you count all the different makis, maybe 15.
Yeah, but
In
it's not even, yeah, right. But almost that, I feel like that's even overstating it.
Okay. And it looks like there's 279 unique cards in Murders at Karlov Manor, that new Magic set that just came out. And then in Seven Wonders, there's 155 cards. And not all of those are unique too, but it gets us roughly in the sort of realm of how many cards we're talking about. And I think that spectrum kind of speaks to what we're talking about and reflects the feel of those different games too.
Yeah, right. Like all of those unique cards need to be like essentially like a number that could show up on a dice or a card
Sure.
in like a different type of
Type of
game
game.
to
Yeah.
have the same level of, I guess, kind of, is it right, like, is speculation the right terminology here, of sort of like, it could be I take this card knowing that in my next pack this is like the world of possibilities.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think
Yeah.
that this is as close to we can get is sort of like a rough measure of like the difference in decision space size of these different games. Though then we get back into the conversation that we've been having for years on the show of how many of the cards that get past you are actually viable picks for you or something.
Right.
But now we're
And
maybe a little bit more in the weeds.
yeah, yeah, right. The decision space within a pack can be much more manageable,
Yep.
but goes as deep as you want if you, right. And I think that's why drafting games, in one of the many reasons why drafting games is just so great for having like an enormously high skill ceiling, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why Seven Wonders gets played by people like you 700 times, and people make careers out of playing Magic and
Sure.
games like it, because yeah, like you can know what's the best card in the pack in a vacuum, but then as soon
Yeah.
as you start adding in other data points, like, okay, but I've already taken these 7 cards, and
Yeah.
and this card was passed to me in the on the third pick, which
Mm.
I can like then infer this about it, right? It just goes as deep as you want,
Yep.
for kind of making strategic thinking, strategic decision making
I
about those cards in the pack.
And I think you just highlighted two really important things. One, you highlighted that one of the real fun things about drafting games is that this is true of most games too, but it's really key for drafting games to work, that at some point the value of different cards or things is divergent among players, right? So eventually in Cascadia, a bear means more to me than it does to you, right? I
Yes.
need that. If we're just drafting points, the decisions in the game aren't interesting because I'm always going to take 7 points if I presented 7 versus 5, right? So there has to be some range in the potential what you get back for you to have these interesting comparative decisions across players at the table. But you also highlighted, Jake, the speculation, which I really want to highlight as another skill that's tested here that I think is really interesting. And you use the word wheeling. So that's the idea that you're presented with a set of options and you have to think through which of those options might come back to you. So in a closed information draft, that's which cards will make it back around the table, whether it's cards in Isle of Cats or cards in Seven Wonders. And those can be some of the most interesting decisions because what you could take in your first pack that you are presented with, we talked about this some in the last episode, right? The best card there might be informed by what card you get back, and you don't know what card's going to make it back to you. You could, in a vacuum, the most powerful card might be really, really great, but the combination of two cards could be even better than having just that one card. And you have to make the decision, okay, is it better to take this just one really good card, or is it better to take the slightly worse card, thinking I'll probably get that combo piece passed back to me, and then I know I'm in a better spot. And that's a fun decision to make because as time goes on, you get a better sense for what's likely to come back to you.
Yeah, definitely. And when we're thinking about speculation and wheeling and what might exist in future packs, right? If I
Yeah.
haven't seen all the packs around the table yet, or in Magic you do the draft 3 times in a row, right? You open a pack, draft it. So like thinking like, okay, what could show up in pack 2, pack
Yep.
3, that like might bring my whole deck together or not.
Yeah.
And I think what's so wild and exciting about these drafting games is like right when you're doing the comparative analysis, like the expected value of any given card can fluctuate enormously, and that's
Hmm.
another big distinction from games having you make similar comparative choices. Like I was thinking of Emotep came to mind because that's a
Okay.
game we've talked about on this show where like the expected value of an action is
It's
of like how many points it's going to get to you has like a hard limit of like 1 at the lowest. Like you can't
sure.
make a play in that game that isn't going to score you at least 1 point at the end of the game. And like the highest possible value
It's
is
like
it's like
three.
3 or
Sure.
4 or something
Yeah.
like that, right? So it's just like really small differences where the expected value of like a one card in a pack of Magic, or like how many like wins is this going to help me get if it's in my deck, versus another card is like astronomical.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that is another thing that just like makes it
Really fun.
really fun and exciting, right? And like to your example, if I say like this card is, I rate it a 10, but these two cards together is like two sixes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then trying to like puzzle out what that means for what's actually the correct pick, which has to do with like, again, estimating like what's the likelihood this does come back to me.
I think another thing about drafting games, Jake, that is kind of ties into this that I want to dial in on to go even more specific is that something I love about drafting games is how much agency you have as a player to make bad decisions or make great decisions.
Yeah.
You can really mess up in drafting games by taking the wrong cards. These are games that trust their players to know what they're doing or to learn quickly what to succeed, right? Because you can really mess up even a game of Sushi Go if you just only take Maki. You're going to be in a bad spot, and you're going to get that feedback that you're doing the wrong thing and you need to diversify. And in a similar way, when I'm playing Seven Wonders, if you focus too much in one direction, you can really limit yourself in terms of, oh, I just didn't get the resources that I need to potentially build cards in Age 3 that I needed to build that have big point payoffs. Or in Magic the Gathering, oh, I'm opening all of these amazing spells and I'm greedy. And I'm just going to take amazing spells. And oh, wait, it's the end of pack 2 and I have no creatures. And I think that that's really fun is that there's the comparative sort of the comparative evaluation of just like this card versus this card, these cards versus this card. But oftentimes drafting games do a really good job of offering you different choices of types of things too. So to be more specific, right, in Seven Wonders, oftentimes you're being presented with resources that you can take versus things you can build with resources. And you sometimes have to pay money to make up the difference. If you don't have enough resources, then you pay money. Or there's also, say, military is another thing in that game. In Magic, there's that example that I just said of I need to take creatures and I need to take some spells or removal spells, or maybe I need to take lands and fixing so I can actually play myself. Or in Bunny Kingdom, a game we just covered, I need to get territory, but I also need to get cities that will make that territory valuable. Or I need to get parchments because those parchments are going to give me sort of value for the other things I've taken. So there's this sort of overall balancing act of drafting games that you have to play that encourage, I think, test your greed more than some other games test because they give you enough agency that they can allow you to be greedy. And I think something that I love about drafting games is that they will offer you delicious meals that you have to say no to. You'll get past an amazing card and you have to say, oh my gosh, I want to take that.
I can't believe this is still here
Yeah.
at
Oh,
this point,
and you have
but
to be
I can't
principled.
take it.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
exactly. And that's a really cool thing that drafting games can do is they can offer you these sort of cherries that you have to say no to, or kind of like force you. Another way of saying that is to force you to eat your vegetables. Sometimes you have to take things that are not exciting in drafting games to sort of enable your strategic path, even though you know there are objectively better things. So there's in that pack. So there's a lot of thinking about what's good for me, not just what's good.
yeah, I think we touched on this like a little bit earlier, which is, but when you're talking about things that are good for me as opposed to good in general,
Yeah.
or in a vacuum, or if this was the first pick in the draft, which is, I think drafting enables us to, as a mechanism, right? And we're talking about these like core drafting games where like the core mechanic at play is drafting.
Yeah.
It always builds in asymmetry. It's like,
Yeah.
right? It's something that gets built. It may not, it may start out that way, if there's some like mechanism where like, yeah, this is kind of where the position you're starting from, but in other ones, all like Bunny Kingdom, right, you don't start with any specific objective, player power, anything. You're all starting from the exact same page. Same with a Magic draft, but very quickly, 2-3 picks in rather, all of a sudden people are already operating from like a completely different base, meaning that a card that's great for me or great for Brendan might not be great for vice versa, which can lead to really interesting decisions too. Even so far as like, this card is awesome for Brendan, it doesn't help me at all, but nothing else in here really strikes me as super beneficial to me. So maybe I'll even go out of my way to take something just strictly so Brendan can't have it,
Hate
which is
drafting.
hate drafting would be the way we talk about that. And I think
So
that like kind of like the emergence of hate drafting is and kind of like this like natural way that we're building our own asymmetry, I think is one of the more interesting and coolest bits about drafting decision making.
And often those end up being really skill testing decisions that you can't make when you're learning the game. You have to really know the game to appreciate when you should be hate drafting to increase your chance of winning. And sometimes this can be really frustrating, right? Because hate drafting in a multiplayer setting can
I think
start
it
to
can
feel
only
kind of
really exist in a multiplayer setting, right?
right.
Because
Because when it's zero sum,
yeah, it's like whatever. It's a point for me is the exact same as minus 1 point for you.
for you. Yeah. I think, Jake, that this is where some of the most sort of interesting decisions get made. And again, it's that same like you have to be really principled of knowing when it happens. But I love when games give you mechanisms that make this easier. So one of the things I really like about Seven Wonders is you have a wonder board in front of you that represents the wonder that you're playing. And hate drafting in Seven Wonders is cool because you can take any card in a pack. And so long as you can pay to build one of your sort of stages of your wonder, Jake, you can just put that card face down and use it to build part of your wonder. So this is a cool mechanism that kind of says, I want you to be doing a little bit of hate drafting, but I don't want it to feel too bad for you. I want to give you a way to accomplish that while helping yourself. And I think that's a really cool way to encourage this kind of decision making in a game that I wish kind of appeared in more games, because it makes it not feel so targeted. Like in Sushi Go, someone just takes your sashimi when you need the third sashimi and they just deny you. One, okay, great. You should have done that probably because you're going to give 10, I think it's 10 points for getting all three. So you can't blame them that much, but it can feel sort of targeted in a way that in Seven Wonders, if someone takes it and stuffs it under their board, it doesn't feel targeted. And also they don't know because it's hidden
Yeah.
information around what's out of the pool, which is kind of cool.
Well, it could definitely happen in both open and closed forms of drafting, right? We've been talking a lot thinking about closed pack drafting games,
Sure.
but the same thing could happen in a face-up draft. We're all taking cards, and I'm the first go. I take the best one for me, and I say, "But you guys know, if
Yeah.
Brendan ends up getting this card, we're all gonna lose." And that sort of like, uh, you
Someone
know,
has to do something about
they
this,
call it
but
like
not me.
tolling the bell or whatever, where
Sure.
it's like
Yeah.
I'm just like, and I think hate drafting in any form has that same exact type of thing where like the person who makes out best is not the person who actually did use their action to hate draft, take something away from somebody else, and certainly not the person who had whatever really valuable thing to them was taken away, but it's the other players in the game
Sure.
who
That's
still
yeah.
got to take the best thing for them and also get the benefit of, the hate draft by weakening two players who are
Yeah.
also participating in the game.
Though sometimes, playing Seven Wonders, this will become really apparent because there's ways in which certain players, if they get the science tokens in that game, it's a set collection game where they scale really dramatically. So if you start to get a lot of the same of one symbol, they're going to give you a crush of points. And sometimes when you're in the lead in that game, you kind of get the sense of, okay, this is my job. I have to control the science at the table and find a way to deny these of other players, where it's sort of
Yeah.
you get to, because you're in the lead. So it becomes your job to sort of keep the other people in check in a way that
Yeah.
I think can be kind of fun.
I think, and it can be a table talk thing too,
Sure.
right? Where it's like, hey, like I'm getting my butt kicked. I'm not spending my precious time. Brendan, if you want to keep Paul's science in check, you better do it then.
Yeah.
Because I'll be losing to one of you either way.
Okay, another thing about the sort of decision space of drafting games and the decisions that you get to make that I think is so appealing, Jake, is the fact that these games, so they sort of force you to stay open, meaning it's the type of game where committing to a strategy right off the bat and chasing that strategic path isn't necessarily always the best option, because oftentimes you're trying to judge what information you're going to get, like future access to cards is going to inform how strong the cards you could take now are. So if you overcommit in a certain direction and then you don't get whatever cards will make going in that direction good, you can be overly punished. So even if you commit really hard and you get the cards you need, if that path would be stronger, there's a certain percentage of the time, right, that doesn't happen. So you have to find this sweet spot where you're taking what's good, but you're not committing so much towards what's good in the pack that you're overcommitting in a certain direction. And I think that type of decision around timing and information is also one of my favorite sort of aspects of drafting games, of deciding when to commit to a strategic path. So, I'm staying open in my first few packs. I'm getting for a sense for what other people are doing, what packs are offering in terms of what's going to be strong this game, because certain cards, not every game in drafting games is the same thing going to be good. Because saying, to go back to my Seven Wonders example again, if all the science cards come in the same pack, any one player isn't going to get access to enough of them that they're going to be strong because they're all pooled together. So in that game, science is going to be a little weaker versus if they're all spread out and I have the ability to just get, okay, I'm taking a science card, then I'm taking another science card, then I'm taking another science card. They're going to be stronger this game. And I love that there's this, every single game I have to evaluate what's going to be good this game. And even more specifically, what's going to be good this game for me in the seat that I am based on the order of cards that I'm seeing in the packs and how they're passed.
Yeah.
Or in Cascadia, in an open drafting game, which tokens are going to come out of the bag this game.
Right.
It
Yeah.
applies.
It's interesting where in a lot of games, right, figuring out what the best, most open strategy is, right, trying to zig while other people zag
Yeah,
is a good recipe for like doing well in the game.
sure.
But there's something about drafting games where it's like the figuring out your strategic lane is happening organically and simultaneously as different people are picking, and the people who do the better job of, maybe the quicker people who are quicker to realize sort of the overall state of the game, like what cards are being prioritized by multiple other people,
Yeah,
can sort of like get into that correct avenue sooner, or often it feels like there's like a point of no return in these games, right? Like once
yeah,
you've committed thus far to a strategy, I had the experience in plenty of driving games where I'm in the last third of the game and I'm like, what, dang it, I think the person picking right before me is doing the same thing I'm doing, but it's far too late
it's
to
too
like
late. Yeah,
meaningfully shift and start doing something else.
yeah,
So I think that's really cool how that's happening. And the other thing I wanted to comment too is, which we mentioned briefly in the last episode, where it's actually okay in drafting games if the different strategies aren't perfectly balanced with each other.
yeah,
In every Magic set ever, there's certain combinations of colors or, just different like deck archetypes that you could draft to that
yeah,
if they come together, they're stronger than other ones.
yeah,
And you'll likely to do really well in the draft. But because people tend to play these games, over and over and over and over, once those are like found and understood, then more people are maybe start down that strategic path, right, to see if it's open for them, and then realize it's not, because there are 3 out of the 8 people in the draft who are all trying to do the exact same thing,
totally
which might make a tier 2 or tier 3 strategy actually become viable
viable.
to win, because you're the only person doing it. And I think that's
Yeah,
like a really cool kind of like organic way that meta can form and evolve. And it's not just Magic, right? I think Challengers, a game that just is on the periphery of a drafting game, I think that one might be, because I feel like it has the same effect, right? If multiple people are going after the same type of colored cards,
yeah,
you're gonna have a harder time, finding those cards that you need to make your strategy come together.
yep.
So like it feels like, to me, like it has enough of that, subtle player interaction, more subtle there than in a pack draft, that kind of like creates this emerging meta, even in the course of a single game.
I think partially too, and maybe after this point, we should pivot to the design discussion. Otherwise, we're not going to get there as we just
Yeah,
sort of
yeah, yeah,
talk about
yeah.
what we love about drafting games. But something I want to highlight with closed information drafting games, and this isn't necessarily how it would have to be, just oftentimes these games are designed this way because the sort of format of the structure of play makes it easier, is that they end up being simultaneous choice games, which I think is partially what leads to some of this really interesting, these interesting decisions that we like. Because if you're playing like I love Cascadia, it's an open information drafting game that I really enjoy, but I always get to react and see what the player before me does, and then that can inform my decision. So it ends up being a little bit the right decision is probably a little bit more clear to me in any given decision in Cascadia, meaning I can make that right tactical decision each turn with more confidence in a game of Cascadia after seeing what Jake does if we're playing a 2-player game. But in a game of where a closed drafting game where we're making simultaneous choices based on what we have in front of us, there's this extra hidden element of not knowing what other players are going to do, what cards they might take. And I think that's what makes some of these games really pop for me, is sort of making those simultaneous decisions at the same time that helps them be mixed solution games that have more. I don't know. I like games like that, those sort of mixed solution where you can't actually know what the right decision is at any given point because it depends on what the other player will do at the same time. So it's ultimately a guessing game of, is Jake going to take this card or that card based around what I know is in his pack? And
Yeah.
you either like that feel or you don't, right? You either want a game that's a little more speculation and guessing or a little bit more thinky and puzzly like Cascadia.
All right. Well, let's get into the design portion of this podcast and think about the knobs and how we can think about making our own drafting games.
Cool. So the biggest sort of consideration at the start, right, is this: if you just say, I want to have drafting in my game, I think the big one that we kind of laid out in the last episode is an open information drafting game where you're sort of more so using drafting as a mechanism within a subset, or is this a closed information drafting game where drafting is the game, or is it some hybrid where you're kind of having open information and closed information? Is drafting the game? Is drafting a core mechanism? Is drafting a supporting mechanism? So let's not dally on that, but that's sort of beyond that. I think the sort of key things are,
We've decided we want it.
yeah, exactly. We decided we want drafting the game. How many types of cards are there? Sort of drafting games are built on these sort of apples versus oranges evaluation decisions. So I think having these different card types is really important in introducing different types of fruit within that system. So we talked about sort of in Sushi Go, there's maybe 5 or 6 different card types. There's the maki rolls, there's different types of nigiri you can get, there's sashimi, that all have these different little elements, but it only explodes from there. Where in Seven Wonders, there's all these different types of cards and then cards within those subsets. And I think that's going to, having more types of cards, and also we'll get to it in a second, but more cards within those types is going to make your game more difficult to learn and have a steeper learning curve, which is probably obvious to say, but I think really key. And an important thing about that is it means it's going to be harder for players to make informed decisions more quickly the more card types there are and the more cards within those card types that there are there. You're going to have a steeper learning curve.
Yeah, it could also make the game feel more random, I
Yeah.
think, right? Like
Yep.
it's just swingier. And if you have 150 different cards that all function differently, then, wow, I just pulled a pack of 10 cards and it's like, maybe it's all the high value cards, right? It's card 141 through 150. And that's just leads to like a really crazy and wonky game state.
Yeah.
Where you can, in a lesser number of cards, you can just have a more controlled environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be that there's pros and cons to that, definitely.
I think to sort of dial down on what you're saying too, I think the greater volume of cards, whether it's types or just cards in general, the more strategic variety there is, but the more likely it is that those strategies don't come together, meaning that there's going to be traps that players can fall into, which can feel really punishing. It's less likely in a game. We're going to keep going back to Sushi Go because it's so much on the other side of the simplicity spectrum. Everyone at that table is going to walk away with some points in a way that sometimes when you're sitting down at the table to even play Seven Wonders or maybe a new Magic the Gathering set, you can just end up making such poor decisions that you sort of feel like, oh, I was a total non-factor in this game. Like I completely missed the mark. I whiffed. I struck out. And I think that the fun though is that when you have all those different options, there's even more to chew on.
Yeah, for sure. I played a Star Wars Unlimited draft after only playing, that's like the new Fantasy Flight Games trading card game.
Yeah.
And I had played one game with the starter set, and then my next experience with it was like a
Drafting
draft.
it.
So I haven't seen any
Nice.
of the cards at all. It was very fun. There's some really interesting things that they do. Maybe I'll talk about in a second as we get further down here. That makes the draft really engaging. But it was also just like, I just have to let this wash over me.
Yeah.
I have no idea like what a strategy in this game could possibly look like. It was cool, right? Because like the heuristics I had from like Magic and stuff
Yeah.
felt like they were not getting me as far as I would have expected.
Yeah.
just because of the way the game works. That was cool, but also just like, wow, this is opaque stuff that I'm doing right now.
Which is cool. That's like when
Yeah.
I think that for me, that was one of the real appeals of Keyforge, where it's sort of like this feels so much like a trading card game, but the heuristics that I have from playing other trading card games don't apply. So I have to relearn this whole decision space. It's like meeting a friend who's the alternate version, the alternate universe version of that friend. Then okay, so the next sort of knob that you have, right, in designing a drafting game is how many things are you going to draft at a given time? Are you just going to pick one thing out of a given pack? Are you going to pick a pair of things? This is where we get sort of the entwined drafting decisions of Cascadia, or picking two cards at once in Bunny Kingdom, which I think this gives you a little bit more ability to push in certain strategic directions. In Bunny Kingdom, you get to ensure you have nice combos because they're going to come together more easily because you can pick them together more easily. Right? So there's a little bit less speculation. You can kind of get a sure bet more often. But then you could also, there's so many ways to riff on this, right? Maybe you have to pick one card from the pack and then discard one card from the pack. Or maybe you pick two cards and then you return a card to the pack. Something like that, where you're taking things out and putting things back in. I think this is a really interesting place where drafting games can play, and it also can really affect game length. I think we learned in the Bunny Kingdom episode that Richard Garfield, one of the reasons you draft two cards in that game is they really wanted to speed it up. Drafting one card at a time was just taking more it was logistically more time intensive than sort of saying, okay, this is too much. Just have people pick two cards at a time and it'll speed the game up a little bit, and it will match the feel of the game that we're going for a little bit more. Or even you can play with this knob in open drafting game like Coloretto, where you say, do you want to draft one card? Do you want to wait and draft two? Do you want to wait and draft three? But there's uncertainty around what you'll draft.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting where some of these design decisions in games, it's like that you see over and over again. It's like maybe it's true that drafting games just tend to work best when it's like one card at a time, and
Sure.
that's like kind of the magic number that creates the type of decision space that is most enjoyable for most players. But I mean, there's certainly I do agree with you. Like it's interesting to me. Like I don't know that I've ever played a drafting game where you have to draft even 3 cards.
Be a lot.
It'd be a lot, right? That would just be a ton of information, and like how big are those packs? And then you don't get the wheeling, right? So it
Yeah.
almost feels like unless you had like 30 cards in your pack and take 3 of these,
Which is horrible. No one
right?
wants to do that. Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying, right? It's like maybe there is something about like one that is right
Yeah.
most of the time. So I also don't think if you're designing a game, like, yeah, maybe start there and then
Yeah.
see if it needs tweaking from there. Moon is an interesting drafting game I played recently where you take one card out of the pack, but there's also like a special bonus action that travels around with each pack. So
Mm,
like when I have pack A, I draft my one card, but I also get a resource that's like printed on a different card. And when I'm
interesting.
drafting out of pack B, I take my one card, but I also get to like I don't know like ready a machine that I have in my tableau, something like that that just like gives the cards in the pack a different texture, but doesn't get us away from that like seemingly appropriate number of cards to be drafting.
And that card always stays in the pack.
Yeah,
Okay, that's
isn't
cool.
that neat?
That's really neat because then you could have, that's another way to add interesting decisions where you're sort of choosing, do I want a card or do I want to take an action? I don't know if it works that way in Moon,
No, you
but
get both,
you
but
get
it
both. You
just
could,
gives like
you,
it gives a different texture to the packs that are traveling
yeah.
around the table. It's like when pack A comes back to me, I'll not only get another card, but I'll also have this opportunity to do a
Yeah.
thing.
You just totally set my brain a buzzing though, because I love, it sounds really cool how it works in Moon, but I also love the idea of a game where you're making the decision between taking a card or taking the action that comes with that pack, knowing that you won't necessarily have another shot at that action. That seems, that's an interesting, now I'm comparing apples to sandwiches.
So it's an interesting thing, but that maybe brings us to like another kind of lever that you want to think about, which is like, is it simultaneous or not? Because the
Yeah.
downside with Moon is it makes it not simultaneous anymore.
Mm,
You
okay.
make your choice and do your thing, and then the next person does that, and then we pass all the
Yep.
packs once everybody's gone, which definitely extends the length of play for one thing.
And I
Um,
think that one of the real pitching points of drafting games in general is the simultaneous nature of play. We can pack a lot of decisions and a lot of player experience into a shorter amount of time because we're making those decisions at the same time in a lot of
Right.
cases. That was like the pitch of Seven Wonders. Okay, the next knob that I think is so important is this is more interesting it becomes less interesting the bigger the card pool gets and more interesting the smaller the card pool is. And it's, are all the cards drafted? How much fuzziness is there around what cards are in the packs? Because this is the knob that controls how much card counting there is in your game, right? If you in Seven Wonders, I know for a fact, given what the player count is, how many there are of every single resource in the first age. But what I don't know is how many endgame guilds there are going to be, or I know how many there are going to be, but not what type there are going to be. So that's an example where there's fuzziness around what the late game payoffs will be, and you have to really plan around that. Actually, that's one of my least favorite things about Seven Wonders is you can build in a strategic direction, and then the best card for you in that strategic direction might just not be in the final pack, which can be a really frustrating experience, I think, for a game that otherwise has a lot of certainty around what cards will be in the pool. But in Bunny Kingdom, another drafting game, there's this chance, depending on the player count, at 3 players especially, we didn't talk about this a lot in the episode, but you're trying to build these territories of spaces on the board and you're drafting those territories. And there can be uncertainty around, will this territory even exist in the game? And the game adds these camp cards that can let you claim territories that might not be in the card pool in that game at all. And I think that ends up being really interesting around trying to plan around the value of certain things, not knowing necessarily. And then the closer that you get to the end of the game, the more sure you can be a certain card that you might need isn't there. Which creates this interesting inflection point. So I think the fuzziness around what's in the pool versus not can be a fun thing to play with. And it can also
Yeah.
really change the feel in terms of the strategic direction, like in a game like Blood Rage.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. I think drafting decision spaces are inherently fuzzy, because I think one of the main things that implies is like many repeated decisions, right? Maybe
Sure,
that's something that kind of fits in to the idea of drafting. Like if it's just something that happens once, maybe that's just making a decision in the game.
sure,
But like when we're doing these things over and over again, like there's a lot of fuzziness there. Like what, even if you're guaranteed everything's going to be there, there's no guarantee that you'll be the one who opens it in your
sure.
pack or in that you ever get a chance to draft it anyway. So I think, for me, it probably fits a little better to have fuzziness remain in the card pool itself.
Yeah,
Because I think maybe what you're experiencing there is like a little bit of friction between the decision space that exists and what is possible.
possible. Yeah. Like, I think it obviously depends on the game completely, but you could imagine a drafting game where you're just drafting 16 cards or something every time, but there's a pool of 17 that could exist. That's going to feel, so one gets discarded every time. That's going to feel really different, potentially, depending on how the card set is designed, than a game where you're always drafting the same 16 cards, you
Right.
know? Yeah.
And like to the extent that there are like hard combos
Right.
too, right?
Yeah.
Like
The
if there's like,
value all of a
if
sudden.
thunder and if you get the thunder card and the lightning card, we've
Yeah.
used this as an example. That's really good for you. And then, you go through the pack and you're like, oh, I guess there was no lightning.
Lightning. Yeah. Okay, so the next knob, or like this is even beyond a knob, this is just sort of the structure of the game that I think is really key, is what do you do with what you pick, right? Is this sort of a tableau building game like Seven Wonders or It's a Wonderful World? Is it a set collection game like Kanagawa or Colorado? Is it an
Is it
area
a
control game?
trick taking game like Nikosu Dice?
Whoa. You drafting? Oh, yeah, but you're dice drafting in that game. Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. Or is it an engine building game or something, right? That's another really fundamental decision that can affect the shape. But I feel like that's less knobby. That's just like design structure decisions.
Right. Like, yeah, that's kind of just like what is well, yeah, right. But I mean, it is important, of course, and a lot of times the game is ultimately defined as that thing that comes next, right? You're
Yeah,
drafting so you can do territory control. you're drafting so you can do trick taking or whatever, usually those would be like what we would consider as like the main mechanic headliner, right? The
Yeah.
headlining mechanic is generally what comes after. Actually, Bunny Kingdom's kind of like a weird one in that case, where I feel like people definitely say it's a drafting game, but I guess that's just because you're just only
Drafting
there's
cards.
no agency after the draft at all.
Sure. Like, yeah, right. Where Blood Rage, you do the draft, then you make decisions based on what you've drafted.
Yeah, same with
We,
Nokosu dice.
Yep. Okay, so the next big thing that I think so much informs the decision space that you have is, do options stay the same throughout, or do new options get introduced as the game goes on? So what I mean by this is, there a set pool that you're just drafting from throughout the course of the game, like Cascadia, you're always pulling from the same bag, or Bunny Kingdom, it's always the same deck that's just shuffled up and you're making packs from, or are there sort of different ages of cards that get to introduce? In Seven Wonders, you always draft age 1, then you always draft age 2, then you always draft age 3. Blood Rage works really similarly. You're always drafting from this deck, then you're drafting from this stronger deck, then you're drafting from this really strong deck at the end. That really affects the decision space because it affects the strategic planning that the designer can design into the game. And it also affects the sort of feel of progress there. But on the flip side, you can have really strange and interesting combinations of things that come at the beginning of the game versus the end of the game in terms of timing decisions when it's one pool.
Yeah. This fits in well with the what we were talking about before about like how many different types of cards are in your game, where it's like how much do you want to control the environment of the draft,
Yeah.
right? Like the more different like ages of cards, essentially that just shrinks the number of things that are available in any given draft, right? All of a sudden it's not one draft, it's right in a wonders or a seven wonders duel, right? You actually have three distinct draft environments
Yeah.
that are fundamentally independent and different from each other. And of course, that's going to be way different feeling than having everything mashed together and having like, kind of one extended draft that maybe is like broken into three chunks.
And when it's broken up, oftentimes you can make more informed decisions around the card pool. Like Seven Wonders Duel is a great example, because in that game, you can win by getting a science victory if you get sets of certain numbers of science, but only certain symbols only appear in certain ages. So you can know when you've seen a certain number of cards, oh, I can ignore this for the round, right? And I think that gives players a little bit more certainty in terms of decisions that you're making. I
And
think this
and
is one of the most
as
important knobs.
designers too, it gives you the ability to say like there can be no science victory in age
Sure.
1.
Right.
Where
Right.
if you had all the cards together, that's the kind of like exciting but also randomness that
Volatile.
creeps.
Yeah.
Yeah, volatility is a great word that creeps in to these like I guess like larger draft environments.
Yeah, which you can have in sort of, say, Sushi Go, where you have the first round, just like all the sashimi comes into it, and somehow, right? And mathematically, it's not super likely,
Sure.
but you can have those games, and it gives it a different texture and a different feel. And yeah, the game that you're trying to make, this is such an important knob for the feel that ultimately gets produced.
Right. Yeah, and if
And
it's like a civilization building game, there can be like thematic considerations too, right? Where like it makes sense thematically the different types of like buildings and monuments that come
yeah,
out. The invention of the wheel, it would make sense that that appears in your game before the invention of the automobile,
right,
right? And maybe
right.
you'd want to like control for that by having different like sets of cards to be drafted in a certain sequence.
Totally. And then I think for me, Jake, the sort of two final things are, what's the sort of deck design in terms of card frequency? So are there a limited number of things, and players can keep in their mind how many limited number of each of those things there are and then make informed decisions around that? Or is it a lot fuzzier because there's just way more copies and you could see them in any different amounts, which is going to give you more variability of the game? And then also, is there card costing? Is this a game about efficiency? Am I trying to make smart purchases in a game like Seven Wonders, where I want to get resources that I then use to build cards, and there's a variance in terms of how much I'm paying as a player to take certain options? Or is it more open, where it's just free to take things, and but the opportunity cost is what comes to the forefront there, right? So I'm taking this versus that. And, opportunity cost plays a role in both those things, but it's just sort of, what are you asking the players to think through? Are you thinking through purchasing decisions, or is there some other thing that you're engaging with on the back end?
Yeah, I think the card frequency is another thing that is just like so important for controlling the environment of your
Yeah.
draft. The more copies of things, the more likely you are to see things. The more it gives players a sense of like control for what's going on in the draft. I can make this pick now because I feel reasonably likely to see this specific card because I know there's 4 copies out there versus like I'm gonna try and thread this needle. Like I'm gonna take this. There's one thing that would
Yeah.
really make this thing, and maybe it's not even in the pool, right? That's gonna create like a very different like decision space and experience playing the game. And then costs hugely important, and I think that is maybe the thing that controls and goes a long way towards like creating that like evolving sense of asymmetry in
Mm,
players where like I need the thing that pays for the thing that I've already drafted, right? Or I've drafted these resources, which means I can afford to draft this other thing, right? Where perhaps you don't have those resources, and therefore, like I feel comfortable not taking this now because I think it's likely that you're not going to want it anyway because of the other things I've drafted, right?
totally.
I think that's how a lot of the time it's done to build that asymmetry in, right? And same with Magic, right?
And I think
Like the
another
yeah, go ahead.
no, go for it. Go for it.
No, I was just gonna say, like, right, if I'm taking a lot of green cards,
Yeah.
right, what I'm considering when I'm choosing, let's say I have green and blue cards in my deck, I could there could be a black card that shows up that's really good for my strategy and it's a really strong card overall, but I'm like considering the actual cost of using that when I say like, oh, I can't actually take this or I shouldn't take this, because that would the cost of it makes it really difficult for it to like fit into my deck over a card that can seamlessly integrate because it's already in the colors I'm in, even though its overall power level is much lower.
Totally. And then I think it's sort of following up on what you said, you made me realize that when you have more copies of a card, if there's synergies between those copies, so in a game like Challengers, if you have a card that's a 2 value card that makes more 2 value cards good, the more copies you have of that, the sort of greater variance in sort of power level you could potentially have, right? So this is where cards like AI in that game, it's a 2 value card that says every 2 value card in my deck gets +1. If you have 5 copies of that card, you could have decks that get all 5 of those and are really, really strong. Whereas if you have you're going to have, but the chances of that coming together is much more rare. So you're going to have a greater variance of power level than if you have fewer copies of those cards because you know that it's less likely that those will come together. Does that make sense? So you
Yeah,
can, by varying the number of copies and how synergies work, you can control for how much variance in power level there is and how tight sort of the player end game potential is.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a important way to balance your game too, in the sense of like, okay, every time a player drafts 2 of this card, they just win, and it's not fun experience for
Right.
everybody
Yeah.
else. So like, maybe I'll just include only
I
one
can only
of
have one of this
those
card. Yeah.
in my game. I have one other one I wanted to bring up because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about, and also is the coolest thing about the Star Wars draft I just did.
Okay.
That is giving players an asymmetric start in their draft. Right? We've talked about
Mm,
how asymmetry is like something that like quickly emerges in draft, as in like players are going to be evaluating cards from very different positions.
yep.
So the way Star Wars Unlimited draft works is in each pack of cards, think Magic the Gathering, right? You get like 14 unique cards or whatever.
Yeah.
But each pack also has one hero card and one base card. In each Star Wars Unlimited game, you start with a hero and base in play. And the thing about the heroes are they are either rebel or empire
Mm,
type, and then one of the 4 colors in the game as well. And then the bases are also one of the 4 colors in the game. And then cards have a number cost for that many resources, but then they will also be one or more colors. So
okay.
there could be a green rebel card, right? That costs 6.
Okay.
And if your hero and or base includes the green symbol and the rebel symbol, that card just costs 6. But if I have the green symbol but not the rebel symbol, it costs 8. And if I had
Huh.
neither symbol on those, it costs 10. So you're actually starting off the draft, right? When I started the Star Wars Unlimited draft, I knew I was red, white, rebel.
Okay.
Right. So those cards, if the card was red, white, or rebel, I could play them just for their like standard base cost. I could include any other card I wanted in my deck, but it would cost at least like two more than the printed cost, which was like a really cool way of. So you did like a mini draft before the draft where we would you take out
Leaders.
the leaders and the bases from all three packs, and you do a draft, so you end up with three leaders and three bases to
Cool.
pick from. So going into the draft, like I already knew kind of colors that I would be more interested in than
And that's a
others. It
great way
was
to
really cool.
solve for the problem that otherwise, Jake, if that's the first time you're ever drafting the game, it's so overwhelming.
Right.
Okay, I have to read every single card. I have no
Yes.
sense for what I should be doing or
So
going
I
for
was
this.
so I was not actually locked into those colors. I think I had like other heroes that were or bases that were in different ones, but I was like I kind of just decided for myself. I was like
This is
I
my
think I'm going to use
signpost.
these, and that worked really well to guide me through the
Yeah,
draft.
that's really cool.
So you could
It's
so the lever there is like what are your inputs before the draft starts, you know,
yeah.
and you could so that was one way that I was able to like signpost for myself like these are the colors I'm more interested in. But yeah, right, it could be like here's your blueprint, right? You're trying by the end of the game you have to like collect the components for this thing, and now I know like when a component type comes up that I'm missing, I'm pre-incentivized to draft that
Yeah.
despite whatever else I'm trying to do in the game.
Pretty fun that you get to draft before the draft too. A draft that
Yeah,
informs the draft. Yeah. So it's not just
so
like
that you can actually play the game.
yeah, I love it. Love it. Well, this is going to conclude our conversation on drafting. I think that's a great sort of point to end on. Jake, I guess before I just say, this is we're done with this episode, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share?
No, I think drafting it's a huge topic, right?
Yeah,
I feel it feels. I think maybe my closing thought on like the design part is it feels like drafting right now is done using like we have like an accepted kind of terms
format.
for
Sure.
drafting, accepted formats. Like you get like between like 8 and 15 cards. You take one or two of them, pass them all down. I'm interested to just see like what are the games that could exist that break that up and then still work. You know, I think would be an interesting design prompt for somebody to pursue.
And I'll close with this idea that I think drafting games are amazing from a board game perspective. I think they can be really intensive for publishers to bring into existence because the art burden of creating a drafting game is typically quite high compared to just creating a board game with maybe a few tokens with symbols on them and a board. You could be producing, if there's 100 unique cards, 100 pieces of art. It's really expensive. So you have to really believe in the game. But I love drafting games and I hope there's tons of publishers who believe in them. So they offer such consistently interesting decision spaces. And I'm going to make a prediction, Jake, that in the next 5 years, we're going to see a team-based drafting game because I think the decision space around team drafting, where we're across the table from each other, but we have the potential to send cards across, and the hate drafting that comes from that all gets amplified. And I just want a game like that to exist. I think it sounds super cool. So I'm gonna, through a prediction, kind of will this into existence. Please make it, someone. Allow it to be published.
Sounds great. Well, thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of Decision Space. It's been a really long time since we've got a review on the podcast. I think almost a month before since we've got any new reviews. So that doesn't feel
No.
great. So, you know, you can make us really happy by leaving a review. If you've made it all the way to the end of this part 2 series, like you're
A
one of
super
the real
fan.
ones, super
Yep.
fans. So we're like counting on you to
Or you just love
hopefully
drafting games.
yeah, or you just love drafting games, but to be the kind of person that would maybe do us that kind of. So that's my appeal for reviews. Please leave one if you get a chance.
And
And yeah, go ahead.
we'd love to read it out on the show if you do. And then the final thing, it's been a while since we've done a deep dive of a game. So if you're a pre-planner, you have 1 week to play a game you've probably played before if you want to refresh yourself on, and that's Ticket to Ride. We're going to cover one of the most evergreen of evergreen titles in the hobby in our deep dive episode that we do next. So if you just want to refresh yourself, now's a great time. It's on Board Game Arena. There's also an app. I think it's on Steam. It's ubiquitous. Give it a play, though. I think you can come into it fresh alongside us. And this is one that I think you'd really benefit from having it fresh in your mind. Maybe you've played it a million times and you don't need to, or maybe you've never played it before. But anyway, thank you so much for those of you who've made it to the end of this episode. I love talking about drafting with you and with Jake. And thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out.
See you next week. Bye, y'all.
Bye.